I am accustomed to performing in weather so damp the tickets stick to your fingers like apologies. I can pattern a smile into a room and watch it bloom with choreographed generosity, an inhale time to the squeak of a shoe, a stumble arranged to land on precisely the right syllable of surprise. When the tent is full, my hands are kept busy not merely with pratfalls, but with taking mental inventory: who laughed openly, who tucked their chuckle behind a hand, who let a laugh break into something like a sigh. It is a craft of noticing, an apparatus of attention, and it has the peculiar honesty of an unpaid ledger. If you have been inside one of our rings, you might not notice the cataloging. You will simply remember the moment when something inside you lost its stiffness. That is my work, and still I return home to my hollow ribcage. The contraption Gus presented that morning looked, in its first impression, like a love letter hurled at a pocket watch factory. Brass and screws were arrayed with the sort of affectionate disorder popular among men who love things that lain in pieces for many years before anyone else noticed them mattered. Gus himself had the face of a man who believed time could be mended with a spanner and forgiveness improved with a drop of oil. He had been to bootleg circuses and municipal parks and still carried the proprietary suspicion that city-owned wonders had too many accountants. The machine sat under a kerosene lamp, half in shadow, as if it were ashamed of how it worked. "It counts," Gus said, wiping his hands on a rag that had the moral texture of previous disasters, and then it returns a shape. "What shape?" I asked, because the world likes to be precise about shapes when the heart prefers to be elliptical. "Laugh," he said, "a kind of laugh. A thing you can stand on, measure, look at." August did not like metaphors when ledgers existed. He pressed a brass counter into his palm as if it were a rosary, and the device's ticking sound suggested a recitation. "If it counts," he said, voice low and suspicious, "it can be sold, or worse, saved for later." "And yet," Etta said, peering over the folds of her coat, "sometimes saving is the only way to make a tomorrow. But we must think of this as saving with permission." Marigold stood to one side, face painted white, lips mapped into a precise line. She had the mime's unerring ability to make the absence of words feel like a roomful of objects. She raised both hands and, in the only gesture that admitted no translation, held up an invisible coin, examined it, and mouthed a disdain so exact it left the others laughing without sound. Nell, brave with that practical risk that comes from walking 17 feet of slack rope with no net, leaned against the rigging. "Let the man try it," she said. "If it tells us anything worth knowing, then it'll be worth the hush. If it doesn't, we'll have another story." I was not particularly brave. I was a man whose livelihood depended on borrowing heat from strangers. I had been carrying a sort of rumor under my tongue for years' mirth. Yes, but codified in absence. When Gus showed me an apparatus that promised to let me stand inside a laugh and look at its joints, I thought at first that I would refuse, because to refuse is a kind of dignity. Then practicalities pushed in. The circus was unthreading. Last week I watched a seam dissolve into the rain like a verb slipping into past tense. How do you ask a tent to hold if you refuse to experiment? Then there was curiosity, which is to say a form of grief that prefers to be active. You do not grieve the same way when you have something to do. I sat upon Gus' stool, and the leather sighed like an old audience seat settling. The lamp hummed. Gus adjusted his goggles, which were less for his eyes than for his theatrical credibility. "You'll wear these," he said, offering a pair of headphones that looked like two small brass bowls. "They'll channel. They'll keep you safe." They fit over my ears as if they had been made for the exact curve of worry behind my lobes. When Gus pressed the last screw, he told me, in the precise tone of a surgeon who is also a tinkerer, that the machine did not actually make laughter out of nothing. That would have been monstrous. Instead, it measured the echoes that laughter leaves behind rhythms in breathing, microtremors in the throat, the way the eyes permit their rims to loosen, and then it rearranged those echoes as if setting bones for a cast. The projected laugh, therefore, was a reconstruction, not an invention. "It's a photograph of the thing you want," he said cheerfully. "You can look at it. You might even warm it. But you can't live inside it unless it's already alive inside you." I wanted to believe him the way you want to believe a locksmith who says he can pick your heart with a key. Gus flipped the switch. The sound came as if from a neighbor's parlor, muffled by a wall, the kind of muffled sound that makes one imagine what is happening behind curtains. It began with the inhalation, a quick gathering of air that indicated readiness, and then an outward bloom, a cascade of frequencies that spilled like a small fountain. There was a rhythm to it, the opening hiccup, the roomy middle, where breath doubled back on itself mostly for pleasure, a tiny bit of high note that suggested surprise. And then a closing like a book being propped shut. If laughter can be said to have an architecture, this one had blueprints. It was mathematically lovely, and I felt nothing. Not nothing in the theatrical sense. My chest did not feel empty of organics, but nothing of that old warmth that stitches the edges of one person's shame to another's mercy. The projected laugh was as beautiful as a musical instrument left inside a museum, perfect to the point of being melancholy. I could map its beginning and middle and end. I could describe with full accuracy the way subtle muscles in a mouth should move. There was, however, no tide of permission. No private breach that allowed me to be ridiculous and forgiven. It hung behind glass, clear and indisputable, and because it was so clean it was also sterile. Gus clicked the device down before I could articulate the sensation. He looked at me with a softness that was almost shame. "It's workable," he said, "not a cure. But it gives you a model." Etta folded her hands and closed the ledger she had been carrying, not in triumph, but with a kind of worry that was almost maternal. "A model," she said. "Yes, but we must be careful about how we use models. They have been used to educate and to entrap. People can be made to feel like charity. We are a troupe, not a bank," August announced. "And if there is a device that can get a roar, we must consider what we do with that roar. Do we sell it? Do we rent it out? Do we create packages, laughter for weddings, laughter for funerals, 2 laughs for the price of 1 if you reserve in advance?" He tried to joke. The counter in his palm made a small metallic clack at the syllables of his anxiety. Marigold, who had been watching with a silence so dense it felt like velvet, produced a performance that asked no permission. She mimed the machine taking the laugh, bottle in invisible hand, corking it, shaking it to test its effervescence, and then setting it on a high shelf labeled "Profit." She took an imaginary broom and swept the shelf, eyes accusing the rest of us. The pantomime's accusation struck harder than August's moral calculation. It is difficult to argue with a mime who is also making a soundless, elegant case out of ridicule. Nell, practical as a walker on a thin rope, shrugged. "We've patched things with gum and song before. If it helps Merrin find his rhythm, if it helps us hold a tent another month, then take it. But don't make the machine the story. Machines make good props. People make stories. A discussion is never merely a discussion in a tent that is coming undone. It is an inventory of trust." We spoke then, as performers do, not in abstractions, but in small, tangible fears. August's mortgage, Etta's list of people she could not comfort, Gus' pride, and my own desperate envy of the ease with which other people's laughter arrived and left without owing me anything. There was a moment when I wanted to leap back onto the stool and demand another sound. Not because of the projection, but because I thought that if I heard another perfect laugh, I might finally recognize some resonance in my bones. That is a foolish thing to admit, the desire to map sadness via imitation. Gus offered me something he called a calibration. He wanted to try again, but with other inputs, the sound of a child's open mouth, a clerk's guarded chuckle, a widow's wary exhale. His claim was not that a catalogue of laughs would heal me as a single necessary dose, but that by sampling the ecology of laughter I might see where mine had gone missing. Etta and I spoke in the margin of a presently polite argument. If you take borrowed laughter, she said softly. "You must always remember whose breath you are using. There is a debt attached. Not a monetary one, but a moral ledger. Every borrowed chuckle is a promise to return it by making space for it again. Otherwise, you are a thief with good taste." She folded the edge of her paper as if making a corner in a story. I thought of Theo and the bargaining in the park, the whisper of consent that had been more odd than conventional, and felt the muscles in my jaw clench. "But isn't the point to test?" I asked. "To learn? Learning is not theft," she said, "but borrowing without returning, even if it's called research, becomes theft. You must be ready to give back." That night, when the contraption's hum had settled into the tense, ordinary chorus of creaking rope and distant traffic, I lay awake thinking of Gus' laugher's structure and what it revealed. The projection had given me something like a map: the inhale, the outward spill, the closing sense of surprise turned soft. I had watched the laugh's anatomy and found my recognition of it painless to the point of being clinical. There was no permission given, no shared embarrassment, no sanctioning of the ridiculous. It was as if one could look at a boat and know how it should sail without ever having seen the water it required. This was not a cure. The machine did not mend the thing in me that made my laughter shy. It showed me where its hinges were, and in so doing, it made the H more articulate. In that articulation was a terrible generosity. Clarity can be a kind thing and a cruel one. It told me that my problem was at once structural and relational, that part of my laugh had been misfiled in someone else's ledger, and that no amount of recorded signature could persuade the world to offer it back. That part, the permission, is not a datum you can exhibit under glass. I left Gus' workshop with the aftertaste of brass in my mouth and the uneasy comfort of new vocabulary. The machine had done what Gus had promised. It gave me a model. But models can be mistaken for the territories they represent. You can learn the map of laughter and still not find the stream. On the tent flap, a thin drizzle stitched the air to the ground. I clicked my old pocket watch open. It told past jokes in its small, conspiratorial ticks, and felt its foolish tickles as if ghosts tried to remember punchlines. I thought of a small place that had been scarcely more than a vignette in my memory, a bakery with heat and the smell of sugar, a woman whose hands moved like the wings of a sparrow, and a dismayed patron who had been laughed at in a way that felt private and cruel. It had seemed then like the beginning of a pattern, the small human seam that expanded into the Covenant towns made with tidy weather. If Gus' machine had shown me the bones of a laugh, perhaps the missing piece would be found in a marrow of a story, an old offense, a compact made in fear, a regretted snort that found its way into a ledger. The machine could show me the scaffolding, but it could not tell me who had walked across the stage and dropped the lantern of consent. In the morning I would visit the bakery and see if crumbs could be a kind of evidence. We had science under our canvas now, which meant that for the first time in weeks, we also had uncertainty dressed as possibility. That is dangerous but oddly kinder than despair. The tent could not be mended with brass alone, but brass can teach you the names of things you thought you already knew. I tucked Gus' manner of phrasing behind my ear like a watch spring and listened to the circus breathe. I had come into that evening expecting one of two outcomes, a miracle or a farce. I left with neither and something else, an instrumentally true picture of my missing laugh, and the stubborn conviction that to reclaim it I would have to do what my training had always suggested: look people in the eye and ask for permission to be ridiculous. The contraption had failed as a cure but succeeded as a lesson. It was an expensive philosophy. I slept fitfully, and in my waking I had the thought that perhaps some repairs must be made at a bakery counter rather than a workbench. Corners of small towns keep their own records of apologies given and withheld, of private griefs that were laughed away in the wrong room. If a laugh could be misfiled into a ledger, perhaps it could be unfolded again with the soft work of story. So I resolved, with the terrible optimism of men who mend tents for a living, to follow the smallest lead I had, a warm hand, a donut or two, and whatever an old woman behind a flour-dusted counter might remember. If laughter had been catalogued in municipal ledgers and clawed into the auditor's cloud-stitched book, then it might also be unspooled by small human acts. If the machine taught me the skeleton, then a baker might know the muscle. That night I walked toward the flap where the rain made a steady, honest sound against the canvas and felt, for the first time since Gus Lamp had hummed, the possibility that my laugh might come back not as a thing reclaimed by force, but as a thing offered and answered. I did not yet know how to persuade towns to give back what had been hoarded, or how to argue with a ledger stitched from cloud. I only knew that brass could be instructive, and that the hollowness left by the machine was not an absence of meaning, but a particular kind of pointing toward people, toward stories, toward a bakery with stale donuts and a woman who might, in a single sentence, supply the connective tissue that had been missing from my life. The tent sighed, the rain agreed. I folded my watch into my coat and let the hollow sit in me like a patient teacher. Outside, the drums of the city were thin and polite. Inside, we had a new tool and an old question. If laughter can be counted, can it also be returned? I did not have the answer. I had a plan to ask, and that is sometimes the beginning of everything that matters. The next morning would be soggy, and a bakery would be warm. If I could find the story of the jilted patron, perhaps the stitch would show itself. Gus' gift had been more honest than I knew. It had handed me a diagram and left the sewing to me. I smiled then, not the manufactured clap of the brass machine, but the small private curve of someone who has been given a map and intends to follow it. And it felt, for the first time in a long while, like a thing to act on rather than to mourn. I have always believed bakeries to be the nearest thing to truth in small towns. The logic is embarrassingly literal. Yeast, heat, the honest geometry of loaves, these things do not pretend. They cannot by any polite stretch call themselves anything other than what they are. A joke, by contrast, is slippery. It wants to be twice what it appears to be, and to be paid in different currencies. Applause, relief. The short $3 note of awkwardness when someone recognizes themselves in the punchline. So I went to the bakery because truth, I thought, might be easier to find among stale donut crumbs than under the bright, slippery varnish of our tents. Or at the very least, in flour and humidity, lies do not hold their shape long enough to be convincing. Mrs. Finch's place was the sort of shop that announces itself before you open the door. Rain drummed a steady, impatient applause on the corrugated roof. Light pooled in the doorway like a small promise. The bell above the door made a polite, tired little chime. Inside, the heat wrapped itself around me like a shawl, and for a moment I forgot theatrics existed outside my frame. My paint steamed faintly, a map dissolving, and I felt naked under it. Mrs. Finch was a round, efficient woman who moved as if she had been given the world on a rolling pin. Her apron knew every secret a sieve ever kept. Its pockets had the habit of softening the edges of trouble. A cat with a reputation for eternal judgment wound itself around the legs of the counter and accepted my boot as a curious limb to be investigated. There was the smell yeast, sugar, the honest sharpness of cinnamon, and the sight of racks upon racks of bread with their brown proofs like small, contented lungs. "You're soaked," she said without looking at my face, which is kindness disguised as information. The way some people notice the time and nothing of the weather, she noticed the damp as a fact and nothing else. "It rains," I said, because sometimes the most radical and honest comment is the simplest one. "It always does when you come in," she replied. "Don't stand there. Sit." She set a shallow saucer on the table between us and poured 2 mugs of weak tea that smelled faintly of lemon peel and something that may once have been a staunch optimism. She plucked a pair of donuts from a box that had seen better fiscal years. They were a collegiate sort of staleness familiar to the tongue, comfortable in their predictability. I ate the first one with the performed gusto of a man whose job involves looking as if the world could be handled with a pratfall and a flourish. I savored the second in private, thinking of how small a salvation it was to find someone who did not ask for a token in exchange for warmth. "You come with your hat in your hands, merrin droll," she said, "and yet you ask for the recipe. That's flatteringly literal." "I asked for conversation," I answered. Our town banter was a steady sifting of information. Her questions were narrow and specific, like knives meant for the bread, while mine were broad and theatrical. The sort of things that made a shopkeeper look at their hands and wonder whether the market had changed. She listened with the patience of someone who had folded duff into itself for decades and learned that patience is the only leaven that does not require time. "We've got the rain," she said at last. "We've got your sort of circus, too. And look." She reached beneath the counter and produced a small scrap of paper, browned and brittle as old pastry. It had been wrapped in waxed cloth and kept near the till like a pressed leaf. When she unfolded it, the paper smelled faintly of flour and ink, a practical perfume. The border was printed with the kind of municipal flourish only found on documents that believed they were both important and eternal. "That's from the town hall ledger," she explained. She did not say it like someone passing along gossip. She said it like someone offering a tool, old ordinances. They had an entire page devoted to festivals. It wasn't always hateful, mind you. It made good sense to someone once. The mayor at the time was a sensible man who liked tidy things. He received one complaint, and that complaint found friends. It was the sort of thing that moved through committees like a pleasant, slow disease. I took the scrap and read it, as if it were a recipe for an obliette. The type was small, polite, and faintly judgmental. There were clauses about gatherings of more than 25 persons and noise abating after the hour of 9, and a strangely careful paragraph about the management of unregulated revelry during inclement weather. The language was neither cruel nor kind. It was the voice of a ledger, which assumes the world can be made right by rearranging words. "It reads like bureaucracy," I said. "That's because it is." Mrs. Finch smiled in that way bakers smile at novice dough, partly sympathy, partly an understanding that you will get it wrong and require guidance. But the change began with a woman who felt humiliated. She belonged to a private grief the size of a small town. Somebody, an artful man, perhaps, or a bore, laughed at her when she was not laughing at a joke. People will laugh at misfortune to avoid feeling it. The one who laughed was not cruel, necessarily. He was thoughtless, and thoughtlessness will be remembered. He complained later, said it was the show that encouraged such excesses. A clerk wrote it down. The clerk's handwriting was very neat. The mayor liked neat handwriting. From neat handwriting it is a small step to policy. It seemed such a banal chain of events that, for a moment, I could not reconcile it with the cosmic neatness of the auditor. The villainy I had pictured in my head was a faceless thing with folded sleeves and a ledger like a rib cage. It was hard to see that it might have teeth from the same ordinary mouths as mine. So one complaint became a rule. I asked. I felt inexplicably like a masquerade of myself. I made people laugh for a living, and I could not make sense of the way the world had chosen to punish me for a private mistake. At first it was a suggestion, said Mrs. Finch. Then another complaint came from another town. Another clerk forwarded it. People always forward the useful things, polite recipes for inconvenience. They are useful because they tidy up a mess for you. The law is a recipe, and like any recipe, it can be altered by adding the right spice, and the weather makers. Mrs. Finch set down her mug and considered me with a candor that had been kneaded into a lifetime of feeding other people's appetites. The weather makers are creatures of habit, she said. They like proper arrangements. Revelry is messy and unpredictable. When towns asked the weather makers to help keep things respectable, when they asked for rain to be a disciplinarian rather than a companion, something agreed. You cannot just ask for that without cost. Contracts want signatures. She folded her hands around the mug as though holding a small, exasperated son. And then the ledger began to take a different habit. Paper likes to be filled. A ledger with a spare column will accept any notation you give it, and over time, the notations can become habits. That is how a complaint becomes a precedent, and how a precedent becomes a system. My point, clown, is that the terrible did not arrive fully made. It was assembled, piece by small piece, by people who preferred order to questions. It was the most mundanely frightening thing I had heard since August counted our applause and muttered about ledgers. There was a comfort in its ordinariness that was almost worse than being told a fairy tale. The idea that the auditor knew. Zoo had grown from the patient accretion of civic preferences made it real, but it also made it, in a way, more approachable. Monsters are easier to fight when they are composed of things you can point to and name. If it had a beginning in a complaint and a neat handwriting, then it has joints. We can find them and pry them apart. The words came out of me like a rehearsed line. I had not rehearsed them. They were the truth of breath. Mrs. Finch smiled. If only it were that simple. Tendrils grow. Now the ledger eats jokes as if they were receipts. But yes, find the first signatures, and you find the smell of the thing. Follow the paper and you will find where it's settled. I thought of the museum of small humiliations that I kept tucked beneath my tongue. My curse, if you could call it a curse, without sounding dramatic, had the provenance of a jest said in the wrong light. I had laughed at something private. I had, once, been the sort of clown who did not consider the possibility that sorrow could be a place in which someone lived. My laugh had been thoughtless in the worst, most human way. Whether that thoughtlessness deserved to have my warmth stolen from me was a judgment that would require a court and a marshmallow of conscience to chew on. But the important thing, the actual practical salvage of the day, was that someone small and practical had written it down and passed it along. Who was the woman? I asked. Mrs. Finch shook her head. Names swell in stories. It's not the one woman we must find. It was always a dozen of them. It was always a dozen small indignities. It was never a single theatrical moment. It was the ordinary chain of polite resentments. Somebody in one town felt put out and another took notice. Someone else liked the precedent. The power of an idea is that it is patient. It waits for people to come along who are willing to make it into a practice. But there must have been a first clerk. There must have been a ledger that first considered joy a thing that could be balanced on a scale. Perhaps. Mrs. Finch's fingers flexed against her mug. And perhaps that ledger is rotting in an archive under a town hall. Ledgers do not tend to move unless someone asks them to. If you can find the archive, if you can find that neat handwriting in the margins, it will show you the wrongness in the right. The first signature will be like a seam. There was a pause long enough for the cat to decide whether I was worth an affable swipe. Outside, the rain had become a thoughtful percussion, less accusatory and more contemplative. The town's gutters hummed as if reciting the phone numbers of the saints. I am sorry for all of it, I said at once, because remorse is less theatrical and more useful than contrition performed on stage. Perhaps I should have apologized years ago to the person whose sorrow I had misread. Perhaps my apology would have been trivial, a tidy bandage on a wound that refused to look at itself. But then again, vows are the only slow-acting adhesives we ever have. Apologies do mending, she said. But sometimes you must apologize to a puddle. There was a particular company in that sentence. She dried her hands on her apron and reached beneath the counter again. This time she produced a small bundle of papers bound with a ribbon so faded it looked like a ribbon that had never truly known color. I used to deliver to the clerk in that town, she said. He left his ledger in my shop one afternoon. He forgot because he was late for tea or because he was writing in the margins. I kept it because paper wants to be held. I didn't want the town to accuse him of being careless. Later, When the law began to collect itself into rules, I tucked the paper away. Better a baker keep it folded than City Hall lose its certainty. She handed it to me like a mother who had baked a loaf for a child who had gone to sea. The edges were frayed. The handwriting was neat, as promised, excessively so, and in the margin there were notes in a smaller, hurried hand. The notes were not only about times and places. They contained comments that read like the small grievances of a person who had, at one time, liked tidy things more than they loved wonder. As I read, an odd feeling moved through me. It was not the lightning strike of revelation. It was a slow warming of a thing previously kept in the dark. The notes pointed to a name, then another. Then a cluster of petitioners who had asked for regulated revelry, not because they were cruel, but because they feared loudness would disturb their placid lives. Fear, as Mrs. Finch had said, is an excellent colander. It separates things from one another and then calls the results sensible. "You want me to take this around the troop?" I asked. "Show August. He'll measure it and frown, the poor dear, he likes to count things. He will be satisfied by hard paper." Mrs. Finch's smile had the sharpness of someone who sells precisely the amount of sugar a recipe demands. "You will do what you do best. You will make it ridiculous enough for people to notice that the ridiculous is not merely entertainment, but also protest. Do not let the rightness of your argument become more important than the people you intend to protect." That's very grandfatherly for someone who bakes. Bakers are all grandmothers some of the time, and we like our bread to be for everyone. You go now, Merindrol. You have a seam to follow. I left with the scrap folded into the pocket of my patchwork coat and the bundle of papers safe between my ribs and my watch. The watch good, ridiculous, stubborn device that it is told me jokes from the past instead of minutes, and one of those jokes was, deliciously, about a man who thought his ledger would protect him. I could not make my mouth form the sound of laughter, but I felt something like the ember of it, a warmth not yet allowed to catch. The rain had softened into a confabulation of whispers. Puddles had become small, confidential mirrors. On the way back to the circus, it struck me how many of the clerks and petitioners who had written the rules had themselves probably believed they were making sensible reforms. They were, in other words, merely human. It is harder to be cruel when you realize you are fighting someone who is afraid of being cold. This, then, was my clue, the first complaint, the neat hand, the pleaders who preferred order. The auditorium, that dry, damp creature that counted mirth like receipts, had begun as a comfort to people who wanted certainty. It was established by those who preferred the managerial to the messy. To oppose it would not be to defeat some unknowable beast. It would be to untangle the human chain that had acquired teeth. Two things occurred to me as I walked. First, apologies to Puddles are more effective than they sound. Second, if you want to make a machine unmakeable, make it public. The more people you involve in acknowledging the parts who complained, who filed, who signed the petitions, the less mysterious, and therefore the less implacable it becomes. A ledger is formidable when it is solitary. It is brittle when its entries become conversation. At the edge of town, the gutters were flushing like a chorus, and the air smelled of iron and soda. I tucked the scrap into my watch and found the orchestra of the circus waiting for me. A muted applause of boots and the soft shuffling of canvas that still clung like a dream. Nell would be practicing her tightrope exercises somewhere in the dim. August would be counting something with his brass counter. Etta would be folding lists like paper boats and trying to decide which regret needed the sternest postage. I thought of the mock trial we were about to stage and of how one ridiculous performance might be the pebble that set a paper storm to swirling. Perhaps it would simply amuse the clerks. Perhaps it would be noticed by the person with the neat handwriting. Perhaps it would be meaningless, and we would be left with a pile of props and damp hope. Then the rain changed its tune, not because it had decided to be kind, but because it was listening. It fell in small, persistent fingers, as if the town itself were leaning forward. I like to imagine that weather has a temperament shaped by attention. Where people lean, the sky leans. I do not know if this is true, but it helped me to move with purpose. If you ask what I did with the paper, I will tell you this. I did what clowns do when given an ordinary object that must be told to be more than itself. I folded it into our next act. I put it into Etta's hands and watched her catalogue it the way she catalogues rain, patting it, measuring it, writing it down in ink as if to give it the dignity of being recognized rather than ignored. August polished his counter until it reflected the letters on the page. Nell read the margins aloud like a prayer and then did a practice fall to show the rest of us how not to break when the ground moves. We were in our own small way, turning the ledger into a conversation. It is not as satisfying on the first day as a single grand victory. It is more like repairing a net. You fix one knot and find two others to be mended. But nets can catch more than one thing, and I was willing to count on that. As we walked back toward the ring, something like attention gathered under the clouds. The bell over Mrs. Finch's door chimed again as if to wish us well. I thought of the woman who had been laughed at, and of the clerk who had loved neat handwriting, and of the way the city hall's documents must sit and dream of the days when they were consulted like oracles. If the auditor had teeth, they had been filed by people who wanted comfort. If the auditor's ledger could be read, perhaps it could be written into a new story. One small thing I said out loud to the sky, as if the weather were my confidant. One ordinary stitch. The rain obligingly drummed its answer. It was not thunderous in its assent, it was simply there, making the kind of sound a town uses when it decides to listen.